Welcome everybody to this panel we're having today on diversity, equity, and inclusion in our EDM community. I'm Ken Kadinger. I'm serving at the moment as the International Educational Data Mining Society's president. Happy to be of service in that role. And today I am leading our panel. We have three great panelists, Nia Dowell, Tiffany Barnes, and Violetta Cavelli-Sforza. And they're gonna share their experiences related to improving diversity, equity, and inclusion in EDM, in the EDM community, perhaps even beyond that. We're interested in building capacity in training a more diverse population of EDM researchers. We're interested in research about inclusivity, whether that be in digital teaching and learning environments, and efforts to increase opportunities and tools for populations that have traditionally been underserved or underrepresented. The abstract said within EDM, but I think it may well apply more broadly. There's certainly been recent events, especially here in the United States, that are suggestive of a greater need for thinking about these issues. We have three great panelists that represent, each one of them represents multiple dimensions of diversity, equity, and inclusion, including race and gender, internationality, age, and probably others. And I suspect that all of us are sometimes on the more included or powerful end of one of these dimensions, and sometimes we're on the less included, less powerful end of one of these dimensions. Personally, I'm a first-generation college student in my primary family, and the first PhD in my extended family. But I think more importantly, I'm a white, male, older American. I have been privileged, really, to be in that position. Usually, I would say, on the more included and powerful end of these dimensions. And if you're here thinking, well, so am I, so this session isn't relevant to me, I think I want to encourage you to think exactly the opposite. This session's mostly relevant for us who have been in those positions of privilege and inclusion, to think hard about what we can do to be better towards creating more inclusiveness, more equity, more diversity in our communities. So yeah, please listen closely, no matter where you self-identify on these multiple dimensions of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So we're gonna start with opening statements from our three panelists of about 5 minutes or so. We'll do Nia, Tiffany, and Violetta in that order. And we'll start with Nia.
I'll go last.
Well,
that's fine, I can go.
Yeah.
So thank you, I'm really excited to be here. And as Ken said, I think it's obviously very timely based on the current social climate in the US in particular, but it's also important to recognize that this is not just because of the recent tension in the Black Lives Matter movement. This is a wider systematic issue, right? That's always been there. So as he said, I am Nia Dowell. I'm from the University of California, Irvine in the School of Education. My research is actually quite relevant to this panel. So I study collaborative interactions, everything from small group problem solving interactions to more distributed interactions that take place in massive open online courses, particularly using computational methods to capture students' socio-cognitive dynamics, so through their language and discourse. And I guess about 1.5 years ago, we started to, happened very organically. We just started to look at the differences between how males and females were interacting. And then we started to look at it across ethnic lines, and we saw these very striking differences in these STEM interactions during problem solving in online environments, where depending on the, the group composition. So say we had a group of 1 female and 3 males in an engineering context, the way that individuals were engaging with their female partners was very, very different compared to a different group composition where females might be the majority group. So we started to look at that in all of our other data sets, and it's consistent across all of them. So everything from the small group, we had, I don't know, 5,000 individuals across all of the data sets, and it's a consistent pattern that we found. So now what we're trying to do is understand, so what does this mean? What does this mean for underrepresented students' lived experiences, particularly in the context of STEM? How does this influence their sense of belonging, their propensity to even stay in a STEM career or keep pursuing one? And then once we've done that, we're going to develop AI-based techniques to start to mitigate some of those issues.
Thank you, Nia. I want to let people know that they should feel happy to post questions along the way in the chat, and including any of our initial speakers here. Tiffany, are you there? Yes.
I'm here.
Yeah, you want to give us your opening statement, please?
I'm so interested in asking Nia questions, but I will give my opening statement and then I'll ask her questions later. I'll just share a few slides for a moment because I've done some work on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and would like to make sure everybody knows about that. If I do this, can everyone see? Wait, what was that? That's the wrong, it was the wrong share. Okay. If I go in presentation mode, can everybody see my slides?
Yeah, there they are.
Yeah,
okay,
they look
good. Thanks for having me. I'm very excited that this is a key issue for our educational data mining community right now. I think it always should be something that we are thinking about, but to give a little bit of context for where I might be speaking from, I want to let you know that I've worked on a project since 2006 that was funded by the National Science Foundation called the STARS Computing Core. Here in the United States, we got funding because we've got dramatically fewer students in computer science than we need for industry, and they are not diverse students. So these are pictures of students that have been involved in our programs who have gone on to be quite successful. For example, Kalia Braswell started her own company called Intech that does summer camps for middle school kids, I think, to learn computer science. Maybelline Burgos works at the Anita Borg Institute, which supports women in technology. Veronica Catete is a research scientist in my lab, and she is helping integrate computational thinking into science and math courses. Kamar Galloway was also in our STARS program, and he is the, he at least used to be the representative for Google's CS First in South Carolina. And Christy Boyer is a professor at University of Florida who's been at EDM before, and she was one of our STARS leaders. And this program actually focused on getting graduate and undergraduate students to do something about getting more people into computer science. So all of the people on this slide actually went out to schools, K-12 schools, and taught kids computer science and sort of translated that into future career success. And these are people of color, but there's also white people and people from majority and privileged groups in STARS, but lots of people from underprivileged and underrepresented groups in STARS. And I think the thing that's and to all of us is that we have a mission for getting more people into computer science and actually breaking down the barriers, making things more inclusive and making things more equitable for everyone. And having that common mission, I think, is important. So research has shown that when professors have a mission of improving diversity in their programs, then students are less likely to leave those programs. So taking this as a mission is an important first step for diversity. So you might be a member of a powerful or privileged group or you may appear to be, and you might not actually even be really a member. But a first thing that you can do to help be more inclusive is to just have the goal of broadening diversity and being more inclusive. I just want to mention that one of the things, sorry, I messed up part of my slide. This thing is wrong. We have a conference that we run. It's student-oriented. It's called the Stars Celebration, and it's going to be on November 6th. You can find out more at our starscomputingcore.org link, and feel free to ask me later about that. But we also founded a conference called Respect, which is research on sustained participation in engineering, computing, and technology. And we just had our fifth conference, for the 5th annual conference for that in March this year. And we may have been one of the very first events to go all online because coronavirus was announced as a pandemic a few days before our event. So we took it online, even though everyone had flights and was planning to go there. So that conference specifically focuses on people doing research on diversity, inclusion, and equity. So if you want to publish in that kind of work, take a look at that. This was probably more than you need. These are some impacts of our STARS work. But basically what the people in STARS do is that we got faculty at academic institutions, at 53 academic institutions, to mentor student-led team projects where the students chose to do something to broaden participation in computing. So we got 2,600 students to do something about it. We had events for over 3,800 events related to it, and students who participated got better GPAs, had better graduation rates, they felt more belonging in computer science, and they developed their technical skills. So I want to encourage you to think about having diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts that are integrated with your discipline. So integrated with EDM. I think there's been some very cool talks on looking at fairness in data analysis, and Nia was referencing that in her collaborative data analysis, but also like machine learning itself has bias inherent in the kinds of data that gets represented. So actually having this as a goal to solve this problem and then using our EDM skills for it, I think is where you get the best bang for your buck. So I just wanted to give that context. And yes, I'm female, but I'm white, so I also am a person with a lot of privilege. So I try to use that to make space for people from different groups. I've had a lot of students who have been, you know, first generation college or African American or Hispanic or LGBTQ, all different kinds of groups. I've had students who live in their car. So there's a lot of different kinds of diversity, and I think we definitely need, whenever you get power, you've got to use it to make space for those without it. Thanks.
Thanks, Tiffany. That was wonderful. Violetta.
Yes. Let me see how I can share my screen here. Doesn't seem to be wanting to go into full display mode. Maybe I can just very interesting.
It usually works well enough just to even out full display.
Yeah, I think that's how I'm going to go. All right. So I'm the real outsider to the EDM community here. How did I end up becoming a co-chair of this conference? Well, I was a local arrangements chair for AI Ed 2020, which was co-located, or actually EDM co-located with it. Then COVID-19 happened and everything went virtual, but I remained co-chair. And my doctoral thesis, which was done at the University of Pittsburgh, was actually about how students use graphical representations to understand scientific argument. And then I started studying Arabic, and I started developing a strong interest in reading Arabic and the cognitive processes that go along with reading in general, and Arabic in particular. And then switched to doing NLP work at CMU, which is how I know Ken and many other people who participate in this conference. And then at some point in time, I came to Morocco. This was in 2005. And my main research area since 2013, and a little bit before that, has really been in readability of Arabic using statistical machine learning methods, because, well, whether you work with learning Arabic as an L2 or as an L1, the fact is that we have very, very limited data, which is why we mostly has also worked with text rather than with the students. Unfortunately, I hope that will change. Now, where am I coming from as I approach this panel? A very different context that most of you are in. For example, we are not a research institution. We are a master awarding largely liberal arts college accredited by NECE. We in Morocco as a whole have data mining and data science have become very, very popular right now, but the focus is really on industrial clients and business intelligence. And the fact is that there isn't very much training available to our students for this. So a lot of it is being learned on their own. In fact, I think I was teaching, or I am teaching, the only natural language processing course in Morocco, and there are a couple AI courses, but not very many. Morocco is a bit specific. I know that other Middle Eastern and North African countries have done much better in orienting students towards artificial intelligence and its various applications. But I can tell you that in Morocco, the first call for AI, NLP related educational and other applications came out last year, and it hasn't been handled very well. Now, so in Morocco, there are a couple of strong Arabic NLP groups. There is very little work being done in artificial intelligence in education. In particular, when AI had asked me for potential program members, I had to reach out to some colleagues at the University of Eastern Finland who had contacts in Nigeria and Egypt to be able to propose some names. I think there's one faculty member in a nearby institution who does that kind of work, AI and ed, some intelligence, maybe just a lot of computer supported work. And of course, educational data mining is a field that requires a lot of data, and Morocco is largely a face-to-face instruction type of educational system until, of course, COVID-19 hit. But as far as I know, there has been no systematic data collection here. There is some potential for it coming from universities that have had online programs for some time, but there again, I don't think data collection has been a big goal of theirs. And very, very recently, the latest university that is sponsored by the Moroccan king has committed itself to the digitalization of educational content to serve a large population. Even our own institution, the Office of International Research, of Institutional Research and Effectiveness, was created formally only about 4.5 years ago in response to accreditation needs. Now, when I was asked to join this panel, I actually started out by thinking about it in one way and then realized that probably something else was intended, but I'm going to speak to both of these. So the first way of thinking about it is how we could broaden international participation. And probably the first thing that comes to mind is how to increase the visibility of the value of educational data mining in the eyes of the academic research community here in Morocco. And one way of doing that is to point out more job opportunities and also to give access to data. We really do not have that data, and it's going to be a while before we can collect it. As Kobigal did in his talk, suggest some interesting problems to explore. And as Rose Lacken proposed at AI Ed in 2018, perhaps try to create more of an international mentoring network so that students who do not have access to supervisors who have this kind of research topic in mind can be brought into the fold. Now, one thing I want to point out is that gender representation in STEM is not much of an issue in Morocco, but we do have a number of issues having to do with first-generation college attendance, and we also have very different cultural groups in the country itself, ranging from very Western-oriented and rather broad-minded to extremely traditional. And we draw students from all of these, as well as some linguistic issues because of their very mixed background that students have, coming from a, say, Moroccan public school where they learn in Arabic and some French, and then switch into English more and more. But there are a number of linguistic issues. Another perspective on this panel is how to avoid bias as we collect data. And one thing that was mentioned again by Kobigal in his talk is that we can help some students more than others just because of the data that we have available on them, which may be simply none, as is frequently the case in Morocco. There's also something that I have come to understand being here and working with faculty and students at our institution now for about 12 years, is there's a huge concern about invasion of privacy and loss of face when you're doing educational data mining. And this is true for both faculty and for students. So, for example, I know that at my institution, trust between faculty and students and faculty and administration is not large. That it's very difficult to convince faculty to do teaching innovation, including collecting any data that might be seen as possibly undermining the view that others have of a faculty member's teaching skills. And so for example, I remember that when we switched, before we switched to online course evaluations, students were complaining that some faculty were refusing to step out of the class during the evaluation. They wanted to see who was bad-mouthing them. And so I'm also concerned that if we use platforms that do continuous monitoring of student performance without ensuring anonymity, which is in a lot of cases is not the case because you want to actually know how students are doing, that some faculty will misuse that information and just use it to show that students are lazy and trying to cheat rather than actually using it to help the students out. So that's a little bit the position that I'm coming from, and sorry if I took too long to speak about it.
Oh, that was wonderful, Violetta, very good. And I'm glad you raised those two dimensions.
Can I add something related to Violetta's? So we recently, I started working with our institutional analytics group, and they started building a dashboard based on Moodle data where they have the data, like, you know, courses that use Moodle a lot, they have a lot of data. And they started trying to use analytics platform that they got, an open source platform that they got from the LAC conference. I don't remember the name right now, but they've given it to a handful of professors, but it sort of highlights which students might be at risk of failing or dropping a class. And they've only studied it with 10 professors, but I think there's a, it's not working very well. The reason is that the predictions are very bad. And they don't give any reason for those predictions. So I think along with this bias, there's also the need to understand how machine learning works, and then, you know, when a model is good and what kind of confidence it has, and then what aspects of data might be being used to make a decision. So one example I know from this study is that the one professor just stopped trusting the model altogether because it kept telling them about students that had B pluses. And I was thinking maybe the data is actually saying that this student is always doing their homework at 2 a.m. for this class at the beginning of the semester. And maybe what that is some kind of flag that the student is prioritizing this class, you know, less than others. And so maybe later in the semester that they just won't even get to the work for this class. But without giving that professor that information about where that came from, there's no way to know how to use the information, right? If you say this person's at risk and the teacher looks at it and say, well, I don't know that. And then I think similarly, we need to give information about what demographics we have or know about in our data systems, right? So if the reason for predicting that a person would not do well in a class, I mean, we can make analogies with the United States algorithms for predicting recidivism rates for people going to jail. if a person's Black, they'll be classified as more likely to go back to jail. But we also know that there's bias in who gets actually, you know, discovered and prosecuted for crimes. So that's built into that data. So if you could reveal that, the reasons for data, that would be better, I think.
Yeah, explanations make a difference in these implementations for sure. A few questions came up about your presentations. I think that Nia, there was some interest in hearing a little bit more about your efforts and results, and as well as the more specific question from Tiffany. You want to elaborate a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So, so right now, like we've started to look at both how these sociocognitive processes differ across gender and ethnic lines, like I said. And so in doing that, I developed a methodology called group communication analysis, which quantifies the sequential and temporal elements of discourse as they unfold over time, so that we can capture things like how responsive, like a measure of responsivity. So how responsive is a student being to other members within the team? And that's captured using, looking at the semantic overlap, right, as the conversation unfolds. Another measure is social impact. So when I say something in a group, is that seen as important and therefore semantically picked up and moving the conversation forward, or is it dropped right there? So my level of social impact. There's a measure of new information and communication density. I won't go through all of them, but basically this methodology allows us to start to understand some of the very much human communication, basic human communication, and how those things differ between males and females. And in that context, you can see that with different group compositions, that's just one of many studies, but I'll focus on that because it's a good example. So when you have gender parity groups, so equal number of males and females, or minority groups where females are the minority, and then majority groups, right? And so looking at the differences in the communication dynamics across those three different group compositions, we see very different ways in the in which female students are responded to or not responded to. Their level of participation, like usually males are dominating the conversation within the male majority groups, not creating space for female students to actually engage. And even when they do engage, they're being ignored. So this is what led us to this next phase, is really starting to understand what does that mean for a student's sense of belonging and propensity to not want to drop out of engineering, and a host of other sort of more psychological processes, right? And I'm collaborating with an individual at UMass she's a social psychologist, and she's done something very, very similar and found that, you know, varying levels of participation, but also that this definitely influences their sense of belonging and their how included they feel within the group. And that's later on, she tracked this over, you know, multiple semesters and found that individuals that were mainly grouped within, were a minority within the group, tended to drop out of the program. So the goal, the ultimate goal here is to gain a deeper understanding of the implications, and then build a system that can actually start to teach individuals, not teach individuals, but help prompt more inclusive interaction. So for instance, it's not that I think that, you know, this is intentional on the male peers side. I really think it's a lack of knowing how to appropriately engage with their peers. And so if you had a system, for instance, like we're interacting and problem solving in engineering, and it's like, hey, why don't you follow up on what Miranda said about X, Y, and Z? Or, you know, maybe you should ask her what she thinks of this and stop dominating the conversation. Just like little things like this that can start to bring awareness to the issue. Yeah, so we're in the very early stages of that, and even sort of starting to understand what it looks like.
You said it's not necessarily intentional on the male side, and that brings up the notion of implicit bias. I'm curious if folks could use the participant window to say whether have you heard of this notion of implicit bias? Could you say yes or no, just to see what sense we get of whether that's a commonly known idea? Some people are saying in the chat, but and maybe the participant window doesn't allow this at the moment, yes or no. But yeah, I'm seeing a lot of yeses, but some no's. While people are doing that, and some questions that came up, Nia, for you are scrolling away.
I know.
But if you can maybe respond quickly, one was, are your data sets all in the USA?
That's a great question. So no, and this is where it gets, to me, super interesting in the context of, so I mentioned a lot of the small group interactions, all but one really are in the USA, but then we have the data from the many massive open online courses, and we started to look at the gender differences and communication patterns there. And so obviously those are way more distributed interactions with people from all over the world. And we haven't started to look at the interaction component between ethnicity and gender, right? So there's obviously these cultural issues that come to bear when you start to think about that, but that's again on the to-do list.
Yep.
I'd like to repeat the question I asked in chat that floated upward. Nia, I heard of a study a few years ago, I think it was in New York for some reason, of group intelligence defined by the quality of a problem solved by a group. And apparently the strongest or only predictor of group intelligence was the percentage of females in the group. I'm curious if A, if you've heard of that study, and B, do you find anything analogous in your finding?
Yeah. So so I think you're referencing, I forget her first name, but Woolley. She did like a big meta-analysis on gender differences and found that exactly what you said. So the intelligence in the group was related to the proportion of women in the group. She also followed up with that and found that actually it might not be necessarily that it's a proportion of women in the group, but instead when you measure women's emotional intelligence, well, not women, when you measure the group's emotional intelligence, it's just that women are proportionally higher than men in emotional intelligence. So in that context, you can see how it's not necessarily the women, it's just the level of emotional intelligence. And so if we had men with higher emotional intelligence, perhaps that would also be beneficial too. So yeah. And so linking that to my studies, another interesting finding is, I should have created slides, but because it's difficult to explain. But anyway, so going back to that group composition, minority, gender parity, and majority. If you just look at the majority and minority, female students, the entire group interaction is far more productive in the female majority group. However, how do I say this without slides? So basically, men actually become better at communicating interpersonally in the female majority group. So it's almost like they are picking up on this more appropriate or beneficial way of engaging and problem solving. So I thought that was also really interesting, that more, we always knew that more females are better for everybody, but it's interesting to quantify it and sort of start to understand that, like, wow, that's another thing, going back to Ken's comment, is like, I don't think that this is intentional. I mean, I'm sure under some circumstances it is, but I think it's actually just a lack of awareness of how to appropriately engage with your peers.
Yeah, my recollection is that the key magical ingredient was simply the skill of listening. And I'm wondering if you could relate the thing you were saying about feedback to individuals participating in a group to Carolyn Roset's work on automated techniques for doing exactly that in mediating computer mediated collaborative learning.
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's more than just listening. I think it's also giving space to actually engage. So for instance, listening is only important if I have an opportunity to speak, right? And in addition to that, it's only important if you actually respond to what I say when I say something, or you just ignore me. So I would say it's far more than just listening. And then in terms of providing feedback, we're in the middle of, because I'm not a feedback researcher traditionally, so I'm learning about all of the similar efforts to provide feedback across a range of different fields so that we can actually start to test out how to best provide that feedback, because you can also understand that this is like sensitive. So on one level, you might want to explicitly say, like, you're not being a team player, you're not engaging with your female partners very well. But that's, you know, that's sensitive, and it's difficult to say that to a student in a way that would produce better interactions.
The specific thing you said was inviting member A of a group to comment on or respond to what member B said, because or paraphrase or whatever. That sort of very specific directed thing is exactly the sort of thing that Carolyn's automated agent does. And one irony is that in the era of COVID, that's actually easier because you can get all of the communication.
I want to up, if I could, to you know, one of the things we wanted to discuss was what we might do as a community, as our EDM community, towards more diverse, more inclusive, and less bias in our community. And as a preface to that discussion, I wanted to mention that I think we're in a particularly interesting space as folks who understand, for example, how our machine learning systems can produce bias, even though those systems aren't, you know, inherently biased, and they're just computers. The bias is in the data, and the machine learning systems are picking up on the bias that's in the data. And I think it's fair to say that just like those deep learning neural networks, the deep learning neural networks in our own brains, especially our system one, if you know Kahneman's distinction between system one, which is more our, you know, automatic reactions, whereas our system two is more thinking. Our system one gets developed through those experiences in life and builds up biases such that we don't even realize we have them, and we can be good people with good intentions, but still do wrong by accident. And on that score, by the way, one book that I've been reading recently is this one, The Person You Mean to Be, How Good People Fight Bias. And there's a lot of great stories in that about how hard it can be to do that. And one of the stories in there is about how symphony orchestras used to be very male dominated in the players. And they had this insight that it might have something to do with their selection process. And they started to do blind auditions of the symphony players where they couldn't see whether they were male or female. And it completely transformed their process. They completely increased the number of females who were always playing just as well or better, but weren't being perceived as such. And we do now have a double-blind reviewing process. And I think, I know as a reviewer, sometimes I'd like to know who it is, because that kind of adds some nuance to it, but it's much better for the process if it's double-blind. So that's an example of one of the things we've done. But I'd like to hear what your thoughts are. You know, we'll start with the panelists, but I'm also happy to hear from our community in the chat. What are some other things we could be doing in EDM to make it more?
Can I speak to the double-blind thing just real quick?
Sure.
I think as a community, we started out as with no blind, you know, the authors, we knew who the authors were, we knew who the reviewers were in our systems, and we have conversations reviewing papers. I think that's an alternative to double blind. I think single blind is where you get the most bias introduced, because there's a purpose for actually knowing who the other reviewers are. So when you're building a community, you want to know who that new person you've never seen before makes a really insightful review and does something very careful and wonderful. I think what we don't have, which we probably should have, is processes to identify and recognize those contributions. When we do double blind, you know, I can't see the other reviewers. Like if I admire another reviewer who worked on a paper with me, you know, if we're both reviewing, I can't see who that other person is, and we can't build a community outside of the conference, you know, through knowing who the other people are. So I don't think double blind is the only way to reduce bias. I think that it is one way to reduce bias of like knee-jerk acceptance of papers from the top institutions. And I just want to pull out a comment that Violetta had before, is that there's also privilege in like where you work and what systems you have access to their data, and you know, access to expertise and researchers. I was even thinking like, you know, in order to even do some of this work, I had to build my own systems. You know, a lot of grad students, you know, if you go to Carnegie Mellon and you're working with Ken, you know, they've got a bunch of systems with a bunch of data, right? And so you can just jump right into analyzing the data instead of having to make a system first. And I'm always making my students make systems because I think it's good for them. But on the other hand, you know, those students have to spend a lot of time doing that and can't make contributions at the cutting edge of research. And yeah, so I just wanted to point that out. So double blind doesn't solve everything. There's a lot of other things we need to do to make our community more inclusive and educate reviewers. I think our program chairs this time, you know, did more explicit education and made it more transparent. I did some when we did 2016, but I didn't sort of post it on the website. It just went to the reviewers. So I think more transparent in all of our processes. And then every time we choose someone for leadership, or every time we make program committees and things, we should consider a lot of aspects of diversity.
Yep, definitely.
Yeah.
Double blind isn't enough for sure. Did you have a comment?
Yeah, so building on the implicit bias and also what Tiffany is saying, in our research also we've looked at the data where it was anonymous. So the students didn't know, like there was just a number instead of their name that can indicate gender or ethnicity, and the findings are the same. And so that gets to the point where like we can actually start, we can tell and we communicate as such even without that visible information. And that's sort of unconscious, I think. And then the broader question of how we can help EDM to become, you know, more inclusive. I wanted to share some of the things that we've been doing in SOLAR. So I was elected to the SOLAR Exec Committee earlier this year, and there's an entire working group devoted towards inclusion and equity, with one of the exec members leading that. And we've done tons of different initiatives, one being scholarships to individuals from underrepresented geographical regions like Africa and South America. We've also implemented, so in the context of the Black Lives Matter movement, there's an entire, if you go to the SOLAR webpage, they obviously sent out a statement, but we've started to curate an entire thing of like, how do you engage? Like 3 categories are educate yourself, because I think that's one of the big things is so many people in EDM, it's mainly comprised of people that have privilege. And you don't understand the lived experiences of these other populations. So you need to educate yourself first. And then how do you take action to support these efforts? And then also within the context of research, obviously, like highlighting the articles, like we're going to do now every year, in addition to like the normal best paper, there's going to be a best paper every year for one that is focused on inclusion and equity. So keeping that a consistent mission within the society is, yeah, so those are just a few things.
I wanted to mention, I'm sorry, Violetta probably has things. I do want to highlight though, a few years ago, we had the Exemplary Papers Awards. So I think awards is a great way to expand the number of people who can get what I like to call reputation points from participating in EDM, right? So many of us, like if you only give one best paper award, only one person gets to put that professional recognition on their CV. But if you take the top 10 or 15% or even 5%, and you recognize all of them at the end of the reviewing process, it's not a lot of work for the program committee, but it's a lot of recognition for someone who can personally put on their CV. So more of us could help more people advance their careers if we do more recognitions.
Like honorable mentions as well as best papers, that sort of thing?
No, I specifically giving awards to like the top 10%, right? So just because we have a certain acceptance rate, like maybe we have an acceptance rate that isn't great for some people's promotions, right? But you can always say, here are the top X%. And if you get into that percent, then anyone at any institution can say, I was in the top 10 or 15%. And that means my work is exemplary. So
Yes.
It's not just honorable mentions. Like, I don't think that's good enough. You have to have an explanation of like, how do these papers achieve this? And how do they get recognized? Have a transparent process that people can point to and say, oh, everyone can value this, instead of saying, oh, it's some committee of random people who decided who they liked.
You mean in the sense that the 10% indicator is the part of the transparency that's clear?
Whatever the decisions, like how the decisions were made for those awards actually being clear, means that anybody deciding for promotions or whatever can actually decide if they value those metrics.
Yeah. Yeah, and the labeling might be another issue there as to what we call them. But I guess what I was hearing is a broader selection for awards.
Right. I'm not talking about participation awards, though. I am talking about, when we know, like the
I know.
the program chairs know who the top papers are. They know.
Yeah.
There's 20 of them. They're like, these are amazing. They know that. Why isn't that something we publish?
In Kai, for example, honorable mentions go to those papers that were highly reviewed. That's what I was thinking of. But Violetta, do you have thoughts?
Yeah, I do actually have a thought. As I mentioned, I think one of the big obstacles to actually doing educational data mining work in some parts of the world, like the one I live in, is the lack of access to data. It's just, we don't have our own that we collect easily because we don't have that much online work or systems that are being used in teaching. And one thing that comes to mind is that, for example, in the linguistics, computational linguistics, or NLP community, you have an institution such as Linguistic Data Consortium that every year has a contest in which they will actually award a free data set to somebody who submits a really good proposal for doing work on it. So I think if some of the people who do have good resources for doing educational data mining followed a similar approach, actually calling for a set of interesting ideas to work, they said, here are the data sets that are available, and propose ideas for how we could get what research that you could do on them, then that would be a way of actually getting researchers who do not have access to those resources to contribute to the community.
Great idea. So in the chat, there's been some conversation about ways to foster wider participation in the review process. So AI Ed's experimented with a buddy system. I will add that Learning at Scale has done some so-called shepherding of papers that the reviewers thought were close but not quite there, and then the shepherd takes some responsibility to interact with the authors to bring a paper into higher quality. But yeah, what did folks think about that? There have been some comments about that those kinds of processes seem to have some positives, but maybe also some opportunities for further improvement. Could we do some kind of buddy system or shepherding of papers?
Might I say something that I think actually what Jake and Anna set up for even our coffee breaks of trying to help us actually get to know each other, I think is a good thing. And I wanted to actually just compliment, I guess, the whole society on actually massively increasing the participation. COVID might be killing lots of people, but it helped us, I think, get a broader representation this year, and we should keep doing that.
Cheyenne?
Yeah, I want to speak to that. I think actually online, bridges a lot of challenges that a lot of women and people from other countries have, right? So not being able to travel to wherever we're having the conference for the expense, for the amount of time it takes, for childcare responsibilities, for all that kind of stuff. And a lot of that disproportionately hits women because they have the combination of childcare and expenses. And then grad students, I think EDM has done a great job with engaging with students, but I think this format, online format, makes it much easier for more diverse groups to attend.
Carolyn asks in the chat, Carolyn Sifan, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, Carolyn. Feel free to jump in if you want to do an audio. What about bias in the research?
Okay.
Yes. Yeah, go ahead, Carolyn. Welcome to our community. I know from the conference break, this is your first time here, so great to have you.
Yes, thank you. It's a it's a great conference. Yeah, no, I've been concerned a lot about because there's so much systemic, our systems are systemically oppressive, right? And they're just so like, what about just the research questions we ask and the kinds of knowing? And I'm originally from the States, but currently in Canada, and trying to learn as much as I can about indigenous ways of knowing, and just how do we address bias in what kinds of research questions we ask, and what we value as good learning versus what we value as rigor. How do we define rigor? And is there bias in how we define rigor? And I'm speaking this as a physics professor who has internalized a lot of physics arrogance and is working on that.
Yeah, no, I'd love to hear the panelists. One quick comment I'll say is we often get biased in science by what's easy to do. In EDM, comparing my model to your model or whatever based on prediction and cross-validation is easy to do. And I think, my humble opinion, we're overly biased in treating prediction comparisons as our gold standard, and we could do better by having broader sets of evaluation criteria.
I totally agree with that, Ken. And it makes for a very boring papers when you have a lot of publications that are all essentially saying my model is better than yours by 0.05%. But we see a lot of those.
So the discussion just inspired a radical idea. What if instead of relying on COVID, we take EDM online permanently? Maybe not every year, but maybe alternating within each year with a in-person, or maybe in alternating years, because it really does have a liberating effect. I know I could not have afforded to attend otherwise.
And I think we could go perhaps to a hybrid or blended model as another way to get remote participation. But I think we're going to learn a lot about that in the coming year in many different ways, including at our colleges. But
could you elaborate what we mean by hybrid or blended?
Those of you who want to come to a beautiful place like Morocco or next year, spoiling the surprise, come to the closing tomorrow, because there'll be a lot of surprises at the closing tomorrow, but one of them will be an announcement of a wonderful city we hope we will go to next year. But even if you don't all go to this wonderful city next year, maybe we can still have some in that city and some attending online. That's what we mean by hybrid.
Yeah. Another thing to do that we've just, we're going to vote on it, is I don't know if the EDM papers, are they freely accessible?
Yes.
Okay, well then never mind. That's awesome.
Oh, Solar's going to move to that? Are you saying Solar?
Yeah. Because I mean,
all accessible.
Because we initially, we're going to do the ACM thing where it was only, you get like, I don't know, 6 weeks, or I don't know what it was. And then we decided that the only people that it hurt, like we can all have access to it because we have the privilege of being at an institution that allows that. But the people that are in different regions or different countries don't have access to that necessarily. So now we're going to do the full free ACM, or pay the money to have it perpetually free.
That's great.
I do just want to actually add that actually making the videos available, we as a society kind of fell into it by accident because they're up on YouTube. But like AI and Ed had all of our videos, but they were stuck actually in Mohoba. So I want to compliment Jake and actually Anna for, because I think actually having those videos available actually online will actually, I hope, get more collaboration going. Lots of people that couldn't come to the conference will still be able to hear a little bit. And I think the personal relationships could be massively enhanced. Actually, we tend to be kind of insular and we kind of know each other. And I gotta think video could help us.
I wanted to, Renee had a +1 to measuring trends over time to learn what works. And I lost track of what he was plussing, but if the—
I think it was, so I think
it was the benchmarks comment that Nia made.
Yeah. So another thing we're doing, I mean, so quantifying the change. So say you want to have a group of people from EDM that are focused on broadening participation and inclusion, getting the current like statistics around how many people are white male, how many people are from Africa, how many, all of these things. And then you can have targeted missions to reach those underrepresented populations. And then in a year, we're gonna look and say, okay, did it work, basically? Did these different types of initiatives actually produce meaningful change in the demographics of our community?
Yeah, that book I mentioned earlier, one of the tough stories in that is about a film award process that was trying to get broader participation, and they failed in the first couple of years. And one thing they learned that you can't just want to do it, you really have to be proactive. And so I was going to invite Renee to elaborate on what he was thinking, but at the same time, Renee, maybe because you've done some work on how to message invitations towards more inclusivity, maybe you could comment on how we could do that better. How can we better reach out to folks to say, yeah, you can be part of the EDM community too, and so we can solicit those papers from Africa and so forth.
Yeah, thanks for giving me the chance to talk about this. I think measuring what matters is really key, and how we quantify this is, of course, there's no perfect way of quantifying it, but we can find proxies that will be helpful. In terms of the messaging, we do find that slight variations in how you reach out and how you pitch a certain course or program can make a big difference in who eventually clicks. And this can be really early. I mean, the shepherding that we do at Learning at Scale is, I think, great because we can give people a chance who might not know the norms of the community. But that only happens to those who actually submit and get past a lot of hurdles, right? If we want to start earlier in what's sometimes called the pipeline, which isn't the most beautiful metaphor, there are other ways of trying to reach people, and that can be in very simple ways in how the venue is pitched and how it is framed. We tried this with some advertising studies on Facebook, trying to get people into courses and seeing how pitching something as about being the career or being about skills made a really big difference in terms of how many women were interested in a computer science course, for instance. And so those things we could test once we have measures that we could then see what the outcomes are in terms of engaging more people from underrepresented groups.
Yeah, it's great. I
just want to highlight one more important thing, that there's a whole lot of unpaid work going on right now with Black Lives Matter movement and people of color educating white people about issues. And it's unpaid work, and doing the work to make sure that our community is diverse, and even doing the organizing and the reviewing and all this other work is unpaid work. And we need to realize that if we keep relying on everything being unpaid, that we're basically still always going to be getting privileged people. So we need to figure out some kinds of ways that can actually give people the space and time to do the work that's needed to have a good community and be more inclusive about who can do it.
Thank you so much for bringing that up, Tiffany. That's so important. do you guys, Nia and Violetta, do you have any closing comments for us, or continuing thoughts?
I think the main thing I would like to say is that I think that if we want to expand EDM to the rest of the world, there needs to be a real, some effort in reaching out and really sort of giving value to this particular enterprise, to show that actually using data mining techniques, AI, artificial intelligence techniques in education has a real contribution, potential contribution to the improvement of education in different parts of the world, and sort of redirect a little bit the idea that people have that the real value of AI is just for business purposes. I think that's something, yeah.
Yep.
And I know that money makes the world go round, but it's not just money that makes the world go round.
I think less and less so, as yeah, I think participation is so important. Nia, you have a?
I guess my closing would just be, I've started to conceptualize this as a multi-level issue where we can tackle it at multiple levels. The first, if you think about like understanding the lived experiences of underrepresented individuals in the community. So I'm just going to use an example, like there's all these articles on like your Black colleagues may look okay, but they're not okay, and educating yourself there. And then also within the community, within the EDM community, having actually targeted efforts that we've already sort of discussed. But then in our own grant funding, so Ken led and brought me in graciously to a Gates Foundation grant that's focused on widening the pipeline and actually recruiting underrepresented minorities so that we can get them into the system. So I think you can see all these different levels and ways that we can start to create change.
So I would love to continue this conversation forever. And I really mean that actually, because we're going to be together again in various forms, right? And we can continue to do better on this. But that might be inclusive of keeping this Zoom room open for a little while, Jake, if that's possible.
Actually, Anna, do you want to jump in here? We have a plan on that, but it's slightly different from just keeping it open.
Okay.
Is Anna here?
Yes.
Hey, just one more thing. If we're transitioning to the next, let's first take a moment to thank our panelists. It's really, really wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you for thank you for the invitation.
Go ahead, Anne.
Yeah, thank you all so much. It was really interesting ideas and lots of things to think about. So as Jake mentioned, we did want to continue this conversation a little bit more informally in smaller groups after this. So you might recall getting an email that we were going to do these discussion groups. We've got a Zoom call that we were planning to start 5 minutes after this ends so that you can stretch your legs for a moment. I'm going to put the link in the chat. It is terrible. So that's joining instructions. If you copy the whole thing, here is also just the Zoom link. And the basic idea is that we'll get into sort of small groups to discuss some of these ideas and hopefully also build community among people at the conference. So we'd love to see you there if you're available. And if not, I hope we can still continue to have these conversations going forward. So thank you.
Everybody who wants to continue should go to that Zoom room.
And
yes.
that one will not be recorded, by the way, for the privacy and confidentiality of people there. This panel was recorded, but the next one will not be.
Yeah, and we would love to hear your experiences. And, one of the things that I've seen has been really powerful across places, including our own campus, is to hear some of the stories of folks who felt minoritized, and those can be painful sometimes, but I think we need to hear those kinds of things. So it'd be nice if there was a forum for people to be able to express those kinds of things without worrying about it being recorded. Yeah, so thanks so much for doing that. All right. So what's the timing? Are we saying 10 after?
Let's say 10 after. We wanted to give people just a short break to get up and take care of anything they need to take care of.
Super. Thanks, everybody. See you in 5 minutes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Violetta, it's the second one.
Okay. Yeah, I figured that out.
Neil just
Yeah, because Neil reposted it. Okay, great.
Right. Just so everyone know, I tried to repost it a second time that it was separate from the Google thing.
Yeah.
So it should,
What is the Google thing? Just,
direction.
Okay. All right.
Thanks, Violetta. That was great.
Thanks, Ken.
One question I wanted to ask you is, you mentioned that gender issues aren't a big deal in Morocco in academics. I was surprised to hear that.
Yeah, I know. It's kind of a funny thing. Ever since I've come here, starting in the early 2000, I've noticed that there are actually a large number of women in the STEM field, and at our university, across the different fields, most of it is business, but also we have a large component in engineering. It's about 50-50. And I've asked people about this, and I've gotten a couple of different responses. One is that inherently in Islam, the religion, there is nothing that discourages women from studying. If women are kept at home and uneducated, it's largely a cultural matter. So this is, I don't know how much I believe this particular response, because culture weighs very, very heavily. But I think the other response is that because women see as a way of liberating themselves economically from tradition, they understand that studying in the STEM fields gives them a better chance at a job that will allow them to be self-sustaining. And that's why they choose to go in there, in that direction. And, and they do just fine.
Yeah.
So
great.
also the high school system here is tracked according, it follows the French school system. So starting, you basically choose to do your high school degree in one of several different areas, and it could be like the physical sciences, math science, economics, economic science, and so on. So in many of these fields, you actually have a pretty strong mathematical preparation coming in to the university.
Yeah, makes sense. Well, Jake left me as the host for this, and I'm gonna, so we can go to the.
We can go on to the other.
Yeah, I'm gonna shut us down here. And
okay, see you soon.
yeah.
Bye.
Okay, bye.